They said the sun held its breath the morning Urena died. The sky didn't weep, nor did it roar, it only watched, cloudless and still as if waiting for something else to happen. Her screams had echoed through the village all night, spilling from the birth hut like waves. Every elder woman in the compound had taken a turn at her bedside, but nothing eased her pain. Some said the labor lasted 13 hours. Others said it lasted far longer, not measured by the clock, but by the way her voice cracked, then vanished altogether before dawn. She was only 17. The child came out red and wrinkled, his eyes squeezed shut, his fists balled. He wailed once, and she did not. Urena's body lay cold by the fire, her arms still outstretched. The midwife gently took the baby and cut the cord. The women washed her, dressed her, and closed her eyes. Her mother fell to the floor and wailed the ancient sound that makes the birds stop singing. The neighbors gathered. The drummers refused to beat that day. Only the wind moved, and even that moved slowly, bending the grass without purpose. Urena had been well loved. Not because she was the chief's niece. Not because she had the loudest laugh in the market. But because of the way she touched people when they cried. Her hands had calmed more fevers than some of the village herbalists. Her voice had soothed more children than she'd ever given birth to. And now she was gone, taken by the same act that was meant to bring new life. They laid her on the death mat near her family's compound, braided her hair, dressed her in the finest white cloth, sprinkled ashwood powder across her brow. The baby, small and blinking, was taken in by her aunt. The village lit a fire beside her body and began the 7-day wake. It was custom. 7 days for the soul to remember its name. 7 days for the ancestors to receive her. 7 days for the living to say goodbye. Each day they came, neighbors, elders, travelers who heard the news from nearby settlements. They brought kola nuts and yams and little cups of palm wine. Some sat in silence. Some cried openly. Some told stories of her mischief when she was small, or of the time she'd climbed the irako tree barefoot just to retrieve a kite for a crying boy. The baby grew quieter. He nursed well, slept soundly, never cried much. Some said he was waiting. Others whispered that he knew. By the 6th day the air around Urena's body had changed. The scent of decay never came. The flies hovered then moved on. The fire near her body burned steadily, but her skin remained cool. Not cold, not hard, just cool like river stones after sunset. On the 7th day her mother brought the cloth to wrap her. But something stopped her. Her hands trembled. The women beside her, older, more experienced, reached forward. Still the cloth did not fall. They left it. Tomorrow, someone whispered. One more day. What harm is one more? The 8th day passed. The fire grew low. The child stared at the mat where his mother lay. His eyes no longer blinked often. They just watched. No one spoke of burial. They just waited. And on the 9th day the baby cried. Not the usual cry. It came suddenly, piercing the quiet of dawn, louder than his lungs should allow. Everyone froze. The women rushed in. And then stopped. Because the baby's mouth moved again. And from it came words. Not full sentences. Not fluent speech. But words. Cold. Wait. Mama. Mama not done. The women screamed. One fainted. The midwife dropped the bowl she was carrying. The baby blinked, cried again, and said still here. That night the elders met. There were those who said the child was cursed. That the mother had bound her soul too tightly to him, refusing to let go. That her death had not completed properly. That a voice from a baby's throat was not a miracle, it was a warning. But others remembered. They remembered stories older than law. Of mothers who died but waited beside the veil. Of children who carried a fragment of a soul too strong to pass. One old woman, blind, near silent for years, whispered, "She is still watching." She held on too tightly. Someone must tell her she is seen. So they waited. A priestess was called. Not from the village. From the hills, where the women still danced in moonlight and spoke to trees. She arrived on the 10th day barefoot, her hair streaked with clay, her face marked with charcoal lines. She looked at the child, then at the mother's body. She said nothing for a long time. Then she asked for oil, a mirror, and silence. That night no one spoke. Even the crickets hushed. She sat beside Urena and lit a thin line of oil around her body. Then she held the mirror above her mouth. And waited. The flame near the body flickered once. The mirror fogged. Only slightly. Only for a breath. The priestess nodded. "She is not angry," she said. "She is listening." So the people gathered. And one by one they spoke to her. They told her what she meant to them. They called her name. They sang songs she used to hum while sweeping. They clapped hands softly, the rhythm she had loved. And the baby slept deeply, his fist curled around his aunt's necklace. By morning, the fire beside Urena's body had burned itself out. The cloth, untouched for days, was finally placed over her. This time, no hand trembled. They carried her to the burial place. They did not wail. They did not chant curses. They sang lullabies. They wrapped her in flowers. They buried her with an earthen doll and a pinch of salt, so she would not forget the taste of this world. And when they placed the soil back over her, the ground seemed to sigh. Not in pain, but in peace. The baby never spoke words again after that day. He cried like other children, laughed like them, slept and played like any boy his age. But sometimes when he touched someone grieving, they felt warmer. Sometimes when he walked past, older women looked after him and said, "He remembers." He grew strong, not loud, but present. And when he danced, it was always near the ground, as if something below was listening, and always had been. At first it was dismissed, a trick of the ear, a mother's grief echoing in the ears of those who missed her most. The villagers shook their heads and crossed themselves, muttering about sleep deprivation, about coincidence, about the things sorrow can make a mind invent. They'd heard the child cry with strange shape before, that word-like sound on the 9th day, the one that stirred whispers and fear. But nothing since, nothing clear. Just a baby's fussing, whimpering, sighs, and babies cry all the time. But then came the morning that changed everything. Urena's sister Adiku had been sitting alone beside the fire, just before sunrise, rocking the baby in the crook of her arm. Her eyes were dull from lack of sleep, her skin shadowed, mouth tight. The baby wasn't hungry, just restless. He twisted, reaching toward the corner of the mat where a pot of water steamed softly. Adiku pulled him back and muttered, "You always did like the morning steam." She hadn't meant to say it aloud. It was something only she and Urena would have known, something silly from childhood. When they were small, Urena used to sneak into the kitchen huts before dawn just to sit beside the water pot and let the rising steam touch her face. "It feels like ghost kisses," she'd once told Adiku, grinning. She'd done it even as a teenager, sitting silently beside the clay oven like it was telling her secrets. The moment Adiku whispered the words, the baby turned his head and stared at her. His mouth opened, and in a voice that did not belong to a baby, in Urena's voice, he said, "It still feels warm." Adiku dropped him. He didn't cry. He just lay there blinking at the ceiling. The sound hadn't been cooing or echo or some clever repetition. It was clear, a sentence, a voice. Her voice. Adiku screamed. The neighbors came running. Her mother burst into the room, clutching a rag soaked in palm oil. But Adiku wasn't hurt, just trembling, pointing at the baby, whispering the words over and over. "It still feels warm. It still feels warm." She said it. She said it. They gathered in silence around the boy, who now curled his fingers sleepily and turned his face to the mat. No sign of strangeness. No other voice. No twitch. Just the normal slowness of infant breath. But no one dismissed it. Not this time. Not when Adiku swore on her dead father's name that it was a private phrase, one never spoken aloud, one only her sister could have known. When others tried to comfort her, she simply said, it wasn't just a sound. It was her memory. And the story spread. By nightfall the village buzzed. Some said it was Urena's soul trapped in the child. Others said it was a spirit wearing her face, mimicking her to trick the living. Some fell to their knees in awe. Others turned away in fear, calling for salt, charcoal, anything to block the unnatural. One man refused to walk past the house again. Another mother took her children to sleep in the bush, saying, "A soul should not linger where it has bled." By the next dawn the elders gathered. 8 of them in a half-circle under the irako tree, their walking sticks planted deep in the earth. Each wore the white cloth of judgment. Their faces were grave. They did not speak until the sun hit the line between shade and fire. The oldest Nwok spoke first. "It is not unheard of," he said slowly. "In the days before writing, before walls, there were stories. Of spirits that could not let go. Of mothers who left too soon. Of children who carried more than one voice." Another elder nodded. "But never with full memory. Never with clarity. A soul that speaks is a soul that hasn't crossed." They murmured in agreement. One woman said, "Then she must be guided." And so a decision was made. They would summon the priest. Not just any priest, but Dyke, the one who served at the edge of the forest, where the veil between this world and the next was said to thin. He was known for rituals that unsettled the stomach and shook the ground. He had pulled curses from the mouths of dying men and was rumored to have once spoken to the dead through the smoke of burning goat hair. They sent a runner. And waited. In the meantime the baby continued to cry, but now every few days a word would slip in. Always unexpected. Always chilling. Too cold. Tell Mama I saw the river. I remember. Sometimes the words came in Urena's tone. Other times softer, as if age passed between them. But always knowing, always full of her voice. The people began leaving small offerings near the door. Shells, bitter cola, tiny pots of honey. They whispered prayers they hadn't used in years. One child knelt before the baby and asked, "Do you still know my name?" But the child said nothing that day, only slept. When Dyke arrived, he did not greet anyone. He went straight to the baby, knelt and placed 3 fingers on the child's chest. The baby did not flinch. After a long time, Dyke stood and said, "The child is not possessed." Everyone exhaled. But then he added, "He is carrying." That made their bones stiffen again. Dyke explained that in rare moments, when death arrives too soon, when the womb is full of love and fear and unfinished song, the soul of the mother may tether. Not in violence, not in refusal, but in longing. She loved him more than death, he said. So she stayed. Not to haunt, but to speak. Atticus stepped forward holding the child. "But what do we do?" Dyke looked at the baby with something like sorrow. "We ask her to finish her sentence." That night, the village gathered again. This time not to mourn, but to listen. The child was laid in the center of the courtyard, in a small woven basket lined with white cloth. Around him, circles of herbs were drawn. Incense burned slowly. Dyke chanted names, Urena's lineage, her favorite river, her childhood nickname. And just before the final chant ended, the baby opened his mouth and said, "Tell Attiku I forgive her." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Attiku collapsed. She hadn't spoken it aloud, but when Urena was in labor, screaming and bleeding, Attiku had been the one who hesitated. Just for a moment. Paralyzed. Silent. "I didn't fetch the second cloth fast enough," she had confessed only to herself. Maybe that's why. Now the words came out through the child's lips like rain after a drought. The baby closed his eyes. And slept. After that, he never spoke in her voice again. Only his own. And though the village still watched him with quiet awe, they no longer feared. Because a message had been passed. And a soul had let go. But some nights, just before the fire dies, if you listen very closely, you might still hear the echo of a young woman's laughter in the breeze. Not haunting. Just passing by. They named her Igemma, which means what is good does not die. A name whispered with both reverence and unease, as though speaking it too loudly might awaken something deeper within her than anyone could understand. She grew with wide, searching eyes. Eyes too still, too sharp for a child so small. Other babies blinked often, flinched at movement, shut their eyes against the sun. But Igemma stared, unblinking, unwavering, as if seeing more than flesh allowed. People learned not to hold her gaze for long. When she was only 3 moons old, her aunt noticed she would turn her head, slowly but deliberately, toward voices not meant for her. A whisper 2 rooms away. The sound of someone arguing in the dark. She would tilt her head like a listening animal, eyes fixed on the wall, mouth closed, breathing steady. "She watches like she's weighing things," the aunt murmured once. "She watches like she knows." When elders came to visit, she observed them with unsettling stillness. If they offered prayers for her growth, she nodded slowly, as though deciding whether to accept them. Once, when the herbalist spoke her mother's name aloud, Igemma's tiny brow furrowed, her mouth twitched, and she let out a low, bubbling sound like a growl. It was the first sound of protest anyone had ever heard from her. After that, no one said Urena's name near her. Her presence began to shift the rhythm of the house. Doors were opened more slowly. Conversations lowered. Offerings were left not just for ancestors, but quietly placed near the child. A calabash of water, a blue bead, a stone from the river. Not out of fear. Not exactly. But out of some deeper caution. Because while Igemma rarely cried, she knew, and when she disapproved, the air around her changed. When she turned 5 moons old, her mother's husband returned. He had been gone during the birth, away on trade in the northern villages. The message had reached him late. By the time he arrived, Urena had already been buried, the fire at her wake long cold. He came with gifts, fabrics, cola, carved toys for the child. But his eyes were shadowed. His lips trembled when he stood before the compound. Attica met him with polite silence. Others watched from behind trees, from huts, from spaces where words lived and judgment waited. He approached the child slowly, kneeling beside her mat with a hesitance that was unlike grief. Ajema watched him. She didn't blink. Not when he said her name. Not when he reached out to stroke her cheek. And when he leaned in to whisper, "Your mother was light," Ajema screamed. Not the confused wail of a baby. Not the startled cry of one roused from sleep. This was rage. Raw, ancient, full-throated. A sound that came not from her small body, but from somewhere else entirely, from within the memory of a woman not at rest. She screamed with such force the clay cup in the corner shattered. She screamed with such intensity the birds in the trees fled. The man stumbled back, falling onto his hands. His face turned white. And still Ajema screamed. Her arms trembled. Her fists clenched. Her mouth stayed wide, and through the sound people swore they heard words, though no one could agree what they were. "She remembers," said the old woman near the doorway. "She knows," whispered another. The man scrambled to his feet, muttering a blessing, then turned and fled. He left the toys, the cloth, the cola. He did not return. When Ajema finally stopped crying, she stared into the space he had just occupied. And blinked. Only once. From that day they stopped calling her the baby. She was Ajema, fully. Completely. They spoke to her like one listens to a river, not always expecting a reply, but always knowing something powerful moved beneath the surface. Children her age learned to be cautious around her. She would stare at them as they played. Sometimes she would reach out and touch a stone they had chosen, and they would immediately drop it as if burned. One child claimed she whispered into his ear while he slept. Another swore she changed the direction of a breeze by frowning at it. Attica began to dream of Urena again, but not as she had been in life. In the dreams, she stood beside her daughter's mat, watching with a calm too still to be mortal. Her hands never moved. Her face held no smile. Just eyes like mirrors watching the future unfold. In one dream, Urena looked up at Attica and said, "She remembers so I can forget." The next day, Attica burned the cloth Urena had once worn, the one she had kept in secret, and scattered its ashes in the river. But the river did not carry them away. The ashes circled, like they were waiting. As moons passed, Ajema's behavior grew more precise. She would not take food from certain people. She cried when specific names were spoken, always the same ones, always names tied to her mother's past, to people who had once caused pain or buried truths. She touched the walls where Urena once leaned and cooed softly as though tracing memory. Some wondered whether Ajema was Urena. Others believed she was only the vessel, that Urena's soul had placed something behind the child's eyes, something that watched and waited and judged. One priestess from the next village visited the child out of curiosity. She brought a charm meant to test for spirits. But the moment she stepped inside the hut, her necklace snapped, beads scattering like insects. She turned and left without speaking a word. Another elder, a man known for his visions, sat beside Ajema and placed a kola nut into her hand. She crushed it before he could close her fist. He wept. "She saw everything," he murmured later. "Everything I thought was buried." They built her a new mat, woven from special reeds placed beside the hearth. A protective circle of ash was drawn around it during storms. Her name was not to be spoken outside the compound. Songs were sung to her, lullabies full of riddles and truth, as if trying to speak in her language. And still she did not blink. Not often. Not unless someone was honest. Then she blinked. What? Like approval. Like memory closing a door. Some began calling her the Watcher in small whispers. Others refused to look her in the eyes. And some simply said, "She came bearing eyes for two, hers and the one who bore her." Because grief does not always sleep in the grave. Sometimes it stays awake, wrapped in flesh. It came suddenly. The voice again. But this time not in a whisper. Not as a murmur woven between a baby's cry or a dream at dawn. This time, it rose like thunder in the center of the compound, clear, loud, undeniable. And it broke something. The child had been playing alone, fingers curled around a red stone. The sky was overcast, heavy with waiting. Elders had gathered under the shade of the neem tree for an afternoon meal. Laughter echoed gently between bites. For the first time in weeks, people had begun to forget the stillness in Ajema's stare, begun to believe she was perhaps just a child again. Then she stood. All at once. No stumbling. No wobble. She stood as though she'd been standing for years. Her mouth opened. And her mother's voice poured out, rich and sharp, full of the kind of fire that does not flicker. "He gave me the wrong root." Silence. The wind died. "He mixed the bitter leaf wrong. He put death in the tea before the first pain came." Igema's voice did not tremble. Her mouth did not struggle to form the words. She did not blink. He did it slowly, with careful hands. And when I asked why it tasted like metal, he said it was the new herb for strength. Gasps rippled across the gathering. Someone dropped a gourd. The twins from across the river whimpered. No one moved. The baby sat down again, and said nothing more. But the echo hung above the compound like smoke. Long after the words had gone, the air remained heavy, thick with disbelief, thick with fear. They said her mother's husband, Igema's father, had returned once, briefly, to mourn. That he had wept beside her burial ground. That he had offered palm wine to the earth and begged forgiveness for not being there. But now the story bent. Not absence. Malice. At first the elders dismissed it. An accident, perhaps. A child carrying grief in ways too deep for language. It had happened before, they said, children mimicking the emotions around them. Spirits leaving imprints. It was not the same as proof. But others remembered. How he had returned so late. How he had refused to let anyone examine the herbs he'd brought before Urena's labor. How he had insisted on mixing the drink himself. And then there was Attica, Urena's sister. She had been quiet since the birth. But now her eyes burned. And she stood before the elders. She told me, Attica said. In the days before the birth. Urena said she didn't trust him. She said he had grown distant, cold. That he started asking strange questions. That he watched her with something else in his eyes. The crowd murmured. A younger woman, Neka, stepped forward from the back. Her eyes were red. I was her friend, she said. Years before. We used to go to the river together. Share secrets. She paused. She told me he wanted to sell the land. The ancestral plot. The grove her mother had planted. She refused. Said it wasn't his to touch. Said she would die before letting him trade roots for coin. People leaned in. She laughed when she said it, Neka continued. But her laugh was tight. Like something was curling inside it. The air turned colder. Another voice whispered. He came to me. Asked if sickness could be made slow. Said he needed a mixture to soften a strong woman. I thought it was for lovemaking. I gave him pepper and husk. But now the veil was cracking. What had once been rumor, grief, half-glance, now sharpened into something heavier. Igema had not spoken again. But her silence only deepened the wound. Because the words she had said were not vague. Not poetic. They were accusation. Specific. Clear. Name. That night, the elders summoned Dyke, the forest priest, again. He came barefoot as before, his hair wrapped in black cloth this time. He brought no drum, no rattle. Only a single bowl of ash. When he entered the child's room, she turned to him. And blinked. What? Dyke knelt beside her. What truth do you still carry? He asked. Igema said nothing. But her hand lifted, slow, small fingers pointing toward a mat in the corner of the room. Dyke walked to it. Lifted it. Beneath lay a scrap of cloth, torn, stained, nearly dust. But it held the smell of the herb used for uterine contractions. The root not meant to be given in high doses. Dyke inhaled. And nodded. The child holds no ghost, he said to the people outside. She holds memory. A wound cut too deep. She is her mother's vessel. Then he turned to the council. And the wound will not close until it is faced. The decision was made by morning. The husband was sent for. He came slowly, guarded, wearing white. His eyes darted to every corner. His voice was low, his words measured. I loved her, he said. I wept for her. I still do. They sat him before the village circle. Igema was placed across from him. She said nothing. But when he spoke again, insisting on his innocence, her mouth opened. You lied, she said. Everyone heard it. The words were her mother's voice, but her posture remained her own. You sold the grove days after I bled. You sold it while I still lay warm. You poisoned the strength I carried, for land, for title, for death. The man rose to his feet. No, he cried. This is witchcraft. The child. But no one listened. Not anymore. The proof was not only in the words, it was in the knowing, the things only Urena could have known. The sale of the land. The name of the man he'd sold it to. The sum. The lie he told about why he needed the coin. When confronted, he folded. He didn't wail. He didn't deny. He simply said, I didn't know it would kill her. And the silence that followed that sentence was long. At dawn he was sent away. Not killed. Not cursed. But exiled. A mark of ash placed on his forehead, not for punishment, but so that wherever he went people would know. Here is a man who betrayed the body that trusted him. Gemma blinked again that night. Twice. Like the closing of a chapter. Her voice returned to the quiet babble of infants. She no longer stood unprompted. She gurgled like a child again, clung to her aunt's cloth, reached for light with the clumsy grace of her age. But something remained. A stillness in her eyes. A weight in her silence. As if a task had been completed, but not erased. And some nights, when a liar's name is spoken aloud in the village, wind passes through the compound too quickly. And a baby, sleeping, frowns in her sleep. As if she still remembers. It began with a dream, though even that word felt too soft for what it was. It came like thunder in velvet, wrapped in silence, but loud in the places no voice can touch. Attiku had not slept deeply since Urena died. Most nights were spent tossing beside the fire, her ears alert to Gemma's breath, to the sudden stir of a gourd, to the sound of the wind curling at the corners of the roof. She guarded her niece as fiercely as her own shadow, watching for signs of restlessness, of memory, of that voice that didn't belong to a child. But this night she slept. Not a heavy sleep, but a slow slip into something thick and dark. The kind of sleep that does not ask permission. That seizes you like a river and pulls you under with no ripple. She was standing on a hill. A hill that looked like the old one near their mother's ancestral farm, the one with the wide tree whose bark always peeled in perfect strips. But something was different. The air shimmered. The clouds didn't move. And Urena stood there. Alive. Not in the way of spirits, not drifting like smoke, but standing fully, firmly, her feet bare against the red earth. She wore the white wrapcloth of new mothers, though it bore no blood, no tear. Her skin glowed faintly, like the moon had taken residence beneath it. Attiku tried to run to her, but her feet would not obey. Urena only smiled. She held a baby in her arms, swaddled, calm, its face pressed gently against her chest. She's heavier now, Urena whispered, rocking. She carries more than a child should. Attiku tried to speak, but her voice was caught in her throat. I've walked far to find the place I couldn't reach, Urena continued, still staring at the baby. But the ground would not open until the truth opened first. She did that. She raised her head slowly. Now she must finish what I could not. Attiku managed to step forward, only a single pace. What must she finish? She begged. Urena's face turned. Not angry. Not sad. But vast. The silence, she said. The silence they buried with me. The sky behind her rippled, darkening. The baby stirred and opened her eyes, and even in the dream Attiku recognized that gaze. Gemma. Unblinking. Watching. And then Attiku woke. Heart pounding. Palms damp. The room was cold. The fire had died down to its orange bones. Her breath came short and tight as if she had been underwater. She sat up slowly, trying to shake off the dream's weight. And then she saw it. At the foot of her mat. Gemma. Sitting. Awake. Watching her. Wrapped in her cloth blanket, but no one had placed her there. The baby's eyes were wide and sharp as they always were. But there was no smile. No coo. Only gaze. Attiku's throat closed. She had laid the baby near the hearth before sleeping, nestled beside a pillow stuffed with millet husk, protected with a charm made of bitter leaf and riverstone. There was no way Gemma could have crawled this far, not at her size, not with her weak legs. And yet here she was. Like the dream had followed her back. Did you bring her? Attiku whispered aloud, her voice shaking. Did you walk through my sleep? Gemma didn't move. Just blinked. What? And in that moment, Attiku remembered what the old midwife used to say about babies who watch too much. They have not forgotten enough yet. She scooped the baby into her arms, pressing her close. Gemma's heartbeat was steady. Her breathing slow. But Attiku's pulse thrummed like a talking drum. By morning she told no one. Not at first. Some dreams were too sacred. Or too dangerous. And this one didn't feel like a vision meant for many years. She moved through the day in a haze, feeding the baby, greeting neighbors, stirring yam, braiding her own hair with tight hands to keep herself anchored. But the feeling lingered. The words Urena had spoken wouldn't leave her mind. She must finish what I could not. And the silence Urena had named. Attiku thought she understood now. The silence of women who spoke only halfway. The silence of girls raised to smile instead of shout. The silence of truths twisted into quiet deaths. Urena had died screaming, they said. But none of those screams were remembered. Only her silence afterward. And Gemma, her breath, her cry, her eyes, had broken that silence. Attiku began watching the baby differently. Not as a burden. Not as a tragedy. But as a message. And she wasn't the only one. Children who once avoided the compound began lingering near the entrance, peeking in. One girl brought a bundle of river reeds and laid it beside the door without speaking. Another child dropped a feather, black with white tips, and whispered, "She blinked at me today." The women noticed too. Gemma stared longest at those who held back their words. At those who smiled with tight jaws. Who said, "Nothing's wrong," even when their bruises said otherwise. She would lock eyes with them and not look away. And something about that gaze, that persistent, patient attention, made them speak. One woman confessed her husband's cruelty. Another told of land stolen by her brothers. A third wept as she remembered a song she'd been forbidden to sing. "I don't know why I'm saying all this," she whispered. "But she just looked at me." "She listens," Atticus said simply. "She knows," someone added. And slowly stories began to collect around Gemma, not as a prophet or a witch child but as a mirror. A quiet witness. Someone who bore the weight of the unsaid. Word spread. Women from the next village came to see the baby who never blinked unless truth was near. One elder, stooped and nearly blind, reached out to touch her and said, "This child carries a door. And it is open." When Attica heard that, she wept. Because she knew it was true. Gemma was a door. Between grief and justice. Between what had been hidden and what must now be spoken. And as the moons passed, the baby grew, slowly, solemnly, never laughing like other children, but smiling sometimes when wind passed through the trees, or when someone said a difficult truth aloud for the first time. Once, during a quiet dusk, Attica was alone again with her. The fire crackled low. The birds had gone silent. And she whispered, "What else will you finish, little one?" Gemma didn't respond. She simply reached forward and placed her palm on Atticus's chest. A light pressure. A heartbeat greeting. And for the first time since Urena's death, Attica felt something like release. Not joy. Not peace. But motion. The feeling of something moving again inside her. Something that had been trapped beneath guilt, beneath fear, beneath silence. And that night, when Attica finally slept again, she did not dream of Urena. She dreamed of Gemma. Standing on the same hill. But this time she stood alone. And the wind bowed around her. She was walking now. Not well, not fast, but Gemma's legs had found their purpose. Each step came with the caution of the earth testing her balance, but she walked, and when she fell she never cried. She would rise again with the same deliberate stillness that had always defined her. People began to say she wasn't learning to walk, but remembering how. And with her footsteps, her voice grew. It was not like other children's babble. There was no cooing or nonsensical strings of sound, no giggles just for the shape of laughter. Gemma's voice came like waves pressed through clay, slow, shaped, purposeful. At first it began at dusk. She would sit outside Atticus's hut in the twilight hour, where the shadows stretched long and the fireflies waited in the wings, and she would hum. Quietly. With eerie precision. The tune was old. Urena's song. One she had made up when she was pregnant, sung in quiet joy as she ground yam or braided her sister's hair or swept the floor with a bent reed broom. No one else remembered it, not the way it truly sounded. But Gemma sang it the same way every time, even down to the rising note on the fourth line, the pause before the final hum. It chilled Attica to her bones the first time she heard it. She used to sing that when we were children, Attica whispered to the old woman who visited that evening. Not after she married. Before. Long before. The old woman said nothing. Only bowed her head. By the third week the voice was clearer still. Sometimes, while playing with pebbles or sitting beneath the mango tree, Gemma would murmur words too precise to be mistake. She would speak in Urena's cadence. Not just the voice but the rhythm of her speech, the way she used to say "n" when starting a sentence, or how she repeated herself when annoyed. One morning, a boy tried to snatch a sugar stick from her lap. Gemma didn't cry. She only turned her head slowly and said, "Try it again and I'll tie your ear to the tree root." It was what Urena used to say. Word for word. The boy screamed and ran. He told his mother, who laughed at first, until she saw the look in Gemma's eyes when she walked past the compound later that day. A look not filled with mischief but memory. Unshaken, ancient memory. That evening the mother brought yam and oil as offering. She placed it at the gate. For the child. For the one behind her eyes. Soon, others began to speak more carefully when she was near. Because when someone lied, Gemma would stop whatever she was doing, stacking stones, tracing lines in the dirt, drinking from a gourd, and stare. If they continued lying she would speak. "No," she'd say. "That's not true." Simple. Firm. And it would always be the truth that followed. exposed not by shouting but by silence as the liar stumbled, looked around and realized no one was defending them. Once, a merchant lied about the price of cassava. Gemma, barely 2 years old now, sitting beneath a tree, called out across the market square, "You told Mama and Jide it was 5 cowries yesterday. Why is it 8 today?" The merchant's hands trembled. He dropped his sack. The market fell quiet. Another day, she looked into the face of a woman who claimed she had never spoken ill of Urena and said, "You said her love was too loud. You said she didn't belong." The woman wept. She did not deny it. Because Gemma's voice had grown too clear, too exact, too sharp to hide from. Children began to follow her. Not like a leader, not even like a friend, but like a compass. They brought her tokens, feathers, beads, old bottle caps, broken bracelets. She arranged them with strange care, sometimes in spirals, sometimes in lines that led to nowhere. "She's drawing paths," one child said. "Invisible ones." The elders took notice. They summoned Attiku. "She must be guided," one said. "This is a gift, but also a burden." Attiku looked down at her niece, playing with a bowl of sand and whispering to herself. "She is the guide," she said. And still the voice grew. By the next full moon, people stopped calling her a child. They called her She Who Speaks or the Remembering Girl. At dusk they came to hear her hum. Women brought their stories, wrapped in silence for years, and sat near her, hoping the song would uncoil their tongues. And it often did. Somehow, sitting in the presence of her melody made it harder to hold lies in the chest. One widow confessed how her husband had died, not by river accident but by her own trembling hand after years of beatings. A farmer admitted he had stolen boundary stones and claimed land that was not his. A healer dropped her head and revealed that a child she had claimed to deliver had actually died in the womb. They came not because Gemma asked them, not because she judged them, but because something in her voice pulled the truth upward, like a plant toward the sun. The council began to whisper, "This is not a haunting. This is a return. And perhaps not just of Urena, but of something older. A force that had long been pushed beneath the earth, under layers of shame and silence. A voice long buried under the weight of keep quiet, not now, and it's better not to know. But now it was rising, not in fire, not in wind, not in lightning, but in a child's breath, in her hum, in her sentence endings, in the way she blinked only when truth was spoken. One evening an elder approached her and bowed. Not out of show, not out of fear, but with the humility one offers a spirit who remembers your childhood better than you do. "I lost something a long time ago," he said. "Can you tell me what it was?" Gemma looked at him. Then whispered, "You stopped dancing when your brother died." The old man fell to his knees and began to cry. He had not danced in 40 years. No one knew that, except her. Because she remembered what others forgot, not just her own mother's pain, but the pain of a whole village pressed into shadow. That night, as the moon rose, Attiku sat beside her niece. She watched her stack stones and smiled to herself. And she said quietly, "You speak with her voice, but you are not only her." Gemma paused, then nodded. Not like a child agreeing with an aunt, but like a priest agreeing with a prophecy. Attiku closed her eyes. And for the first time since Urena's death, she heard laughter in her heart, soft, distant, like a bird just out of reach. Because the voice had grown stronger. And it would not fade again. They heard the horses before they saw them. Hooves like drums against the dry red earth, kicking up clouds of dust thick enough to choke the morning sun. The ground shuddered slightly, a tremor that made even the dogs retreat under huts and the market women pause with their woven trays mid-air. Attiku stepped outside with Gemma in her arms, squinting toward the horizon, where a procession of men approached, 6 on horseback, another 4 walking beside them, carrying long staffs and swords at their waists. And at the center of them, on the tallest black horse, was the man the village hadn't seen in nearly 2 seasons. Urena's husband. The father of the child. The man the earth had not swallowed, though many said it should have. He wore white again, not for mourning this time but for appearance, the kind of white that glimmered too clean, too deliberate. His face was hardened, cheeks leaner than before, eyes too alert. He didn't greet the elders. He didn't bow. He dismounted with the posture of ownership. Attiku gripped Gemma tighter and stepped back. "I've come for my daughter," he said aloud, not to anyone in particular, but to the air itself, as if the land owed him something. "You left her to silence," one of the elders said, stepping forward. "Now you want her to speak on your terms?" The man did not flinch. His eyes flicked across the compound, stopping briefly on Attiku and the bundle in her arms. But he did not step toward her yet. There are whispers, he said. That the child speaks things no child should. That she sings songs from the grave and shames the elders. That she names people's lies with her mother's voice. No one corrected him. Because every word was true. She needs cleansing, he said. A priest from the high river shrine is waiting. He will perform the rite. Wash the mother's spirit out. Make her whole. Attica laughed, low, bitter, more a breath through clenched teeth than joy. You mean wash the truth away, she said. The man's jaw tightened. She is mine. She was never yours, Attica said. With that he moved. He didn't lunge, not yet, but he walked toward her, each step measured, practiced, flanked by two of the armed men. He stopped a few feet away, eyes fixed on Igemma. She was awake now, not crying, not fidgeting. Just watching. The silence pressed down on the compound like a heavy blanket. Attica didn't step back. But neither did she offer the child. I won't hurt her, he said softly. I just want her whole. She is more whole now than she would have been with you. Give me the child. He reached out. Slowly. His fingers brushed the edge of the cloth wrapped around Igemma. And then she spoke. Not loud. Not angry. Just 3 clean words. Obina Chisholm Ease. The man froze. It was his full name. Not the one used in the village. Not the one recorded on the marriage papers. But the one whispered by his mother during his naming ceremony, with the second name hidden until adulthood, known only to his parents and his wife. The guards shifted uneasily. But the girl was not finished. Still in Atticu's arms, Igemma raised her hand. Her voice was unmistakably Urena's now. A pitch deeper than her body, full of old thunder wrapped in a child's throat. August 13th, she said. On the day your grandmother bled into the soil and said you'd walk with 2 shadows. One for your face, one for your fear. Obina stepped back. His lips parted slightly, and for a moment, he looked not like a man returning with power, but like a boy remembering something he had buried. Still, Igemma didn't blink. She spoke one more word. Tamar. He collapsed. Dropped to his knees like his legs had vanished beneath him. Because Tamar was the name he had once whispered to Urena in the dark, during a storm, the night before she told him she was pregnant. It wasn't just a name. It was a promise. It was a secret. Something private. Intimate. Something he had never told another soul. His hands began to shake. Not with rage. With terror. He looked at the child, really looked, for the first time. And what he saw wasn't just flesh of his flesh. It was memory. It was judgment. It was the part of Urena that refused to stay quiet in the ground. He tried to speak. Tried to say her name. But his tongue felt thick, foreign. The guard stepped forward instinctively, but Attica raised a hand. She hasn't cursed him, she said. She's only showing him himself. Still shaking, Obina tried to rise. His fingers dug into the earth. His knees buckled. She's not natural, he gasped. This isn't right. She's not yours to define, Attica said. The oldest elder stepped forward then, a man called Papa Onyudo, whose eyes had seen 3 generations born and buried. He looked at Obina and then at Igemma and said quietly, We once feared the dead returning. But this is not a haunting. This is remembrance. You cannot wash it away. Obina looked up at the sky as if expecting it to open and swallow him. But it did not. It only watched. Like Igemma. He rose, staggering, using the arm of one of the guards for balance. But when he reached for his horse, the animal reared slightly, uneasy, refusing to be touched. He stepped away, red-faced and breathing hard. The guards asked if they should act. He said nothing. Only turned and began walking away. No blessing was given. No child was taken. The horsemen followed, silent and slow, as dust reclaimed their tracks. And in the village, people began to breathe again. Igemma yawned. As if she had done nothing unusual at all. Attica pressed her lips to the child's temple. That night they didn't speak of it. Not aloud. But in every home the story grew. The girl who called a man by the name he hid. The child who unshook the hands of warriors. The voice that refused to be cleansed. And when women walked the path at dusk and saw her playing in the dirt with leaves and seeds, they smiled gently and said, She sees everything. She knows everything. She is not afraid of names. And they too began to speak the names they had once buried. It began with silence. Not the kind that comes gently like sleep or snowfall. But a heavy, aching silence that pressed against the eardrums and made people turn suddenly, thinking they'd heard a whisper that wasn't there. Igemma had not spoken for a full day. No songs at dusk. No humming from the mat. No strange truths rising from her chest like smoke. She simply sat, eyes open, breath steady, watching the world with that gaze that had unsettled the most righteous and broken the most proud. But she made no sound. Ataku was the first to notice. She crouched beside the child that evening after placing roasted plantains near the fire and said softly, "You're quiet today." Ajema looked up at her. Not blankly. Not tired. Just waiting. By midnight the fog arrived. Thick, sour sweet. Rolling low over the ground, curling beneath doors and between the ankles of goats. It muffled footsteps, erased outlines. Even the dogs refused to bark. Their ears lay flat, their bodies curled tightly in corners as if they sensed something walking the fog that did not belong to the living. The sky was starless. Even the moon, once a faithful witness to Ijema's songs, had hidden. And the village knew. Something had shifted. It started with a window, the one in the late healer's hut, long abandoned. A girl fetching firewood saw it first, a silhouette behind the curtain, unmistakably female, tall, unmoving. She froze, stared. The figure didn't blink. Didn't move. Just watched her. And when she ran, the fog followed her all the way home. That same hour, another woman screamed. She had looked into her pot of water and found it steaming, not from fire but from the inside out, as though the well had turned feverish. Others confirmed it. Every jug drawn from the village well was now warm, like something beneath the earth had exhaled. Attica didn't sleep. She sat cross-legged beside Ijema, who lay still on a mat made from river reed and ashcloth. The girl's eyes were closed but not in rest. More like she was listening inward, to something only she could hear. And then the flames. It began as a sharp crack, like a whip snapping the night. Then the roof of their family hut burst into colorless flame. Fire without heat, brightness without smoke. It rose fast, too fast, licking the thatch and wood as if it had waited years for permission. Ataku shouted. Neighbors came running. But when they neared, the heat pushed them back, not with pain but with warning. The flames moved like dancers. They weaved and bent, split and curled. Not wild but guided. As though they carried rhythm, not rage. And inside, silence. Ijema. Ataku screamed, tears breaking loose. Ijema. Someone tried to hold her back, but she shoved them aside, rushing toward the blaze. The moment her foot crossed the boundary of the hut, the flames died. Not slowly. All at once. As though they had never existed, only pretended. What remained was ash. Soft gray dust on the floor, on the walls, on the cooking stones. And in the very center, wrapped in a sheet of ash and palm fibers, lay the child. Untouched. Eyes wide open. Watching her. Ataku fell to her knees. Ijema, she whispered. The child didn't speak. She simply lifted one hand, and opened her fingers. In her palm was a small, curled strip of bark. Written on it, burned into it by no blade or ink, was one word. Ready. By dawn word had spread. They whispered of the fire that did not burn. The shadow that stood in doorways. The well that breathed heat. And the child who had finally gone silent. Not in weakness but in gathering. For something had arrived in that stillness. Not vengeance. Not madness. But truth that had waited too long. And now the storm would speak. The morning air was thick with heat, though the sun had barely risen. Chickens scratched near the edges of huts, and distant drums from a naming ceremony thudded softly like a second heartbeat for the village. But no one moved freely that day. Everyone was waiting. They gathered near the council grounds, beside the carved Irako post that marked the center of judgment. Children clung to their mothers. Elders leaned on staffs. Eyes darted toward the edge of the gathering where Ataku stood, holding Ijema in her arms, the child now walking, speaking, and more than ever, watching. She had not spoken a single word since the fire. Not even a hum. But she saw everything. And when Obina, Urena's husband, was finally led forward, wrists bound loosely with vine, everyone knew the stillness had reached its breaking point. He looked older than he had weeks before, eyes sunken, shoulders hunched as though the air above him had grown heavier. Since the night of the fire he had stopped speaking. Not from stubbornness but from inability. His tongue hung in silence, thick in his mouth. When people asked questions he only blinked or shook his head. And when Ijema looked at him he always turned away. Until now. Ataku set the child down gently in the circle of elders. She did not stumble. She did not cry. She walked to the center, barefoot in the dust, and turned to face the crowd. Then, without preamble, without question, she lifted her hand and pointed at the man who once claimed to be her father. Her eyes, dark and shining, held him in place like stone. And she spoke, clearer than ever before. The voice that came out of her body did not belong to a child. It belonged to Urena. "He took my breath," she said. Gasps fluttered through the crowd like startled birds. Obina flinched as though slapped by something larger than words. "I took his peace," the child continued. The words were sharp, measured, carried not by anger but by certainty. Obina dropped to his knees. Blood began to leak from his eyes. Not tears, blood. Thick and slow, trailing down his cheeks like red rain drawn from a wound deeper than skin. His mouth opened in a silent scream. But still no sound came. His hands clutched at his chest, then his throat, then simply trembled in his lap. No one moved to help him. Because they knew. This was not illness. This was justice. It was not punishment from above, but the world balancing itself, through the lips of a girl who was no longer just a girl. Elder Anuyudo stepped forward, staff heavy in hand. He studied Igema, who now stood motionless, as though the spirit in her had spoken and returned to stillness. He bowed low. Then spoke to the gathered crowd. "You all heard," he said. "Not vengeance. Not violence. Only truth." Whispers rippled like wind through dry grass. "Two spirits walk in one body," he said. "The child and the mother. The seed and the root. The voice and the vessel." Heads bowed. Even the skeptical ones. For who could deny what had just happened? He looked at Ataku. "She is no longer yours alone," he said gently. Ataku nodded. Her eyes brimmed with tears but not sorrow. She already knew. Elder Anuyudo turned to the people. "From this day forward she will be raised with sacred rites. As a child of flesh, and as a spirit returned. She will live in the sacred hut, taught by those who speak with ancestors. Fed with both food and fire. Watched by the living and remembered by the dead." There were no objections. Not one. Because when the eyes of the child turned to them, they felt stripped of everything false. Igema sat down in the dust then. Quiet again. But now the silence carried reverence, not dread. And even as Obina was led away, weeping blood, dragging his feet like a man who no longer belonged to time, the villagers did not watch him. They watched her. The daughter. The mother. The judgment in small human form. And in her silence, truth would always speak. The years passed like wind through tall grass, sometimes loud, sometimes soft, always moving. Igema grew. Not too tall, not too fast, but with the quiet strength of a tree that knew its roots reached deeper than anyone could see. Her hair coiled thick around her head like a crown of memory, and her eyes held the same steady weight they had always held, as if each blink marked a truth written somewhere older than words. She did not speak often. But when she did, people listened. Because her voice was no longer just her own. Most of the time, it was hers, clear, calm, warm as a gourd of palm milk left in the sun. But sometimes, in moments no one could predict, it would shift. Her tone would change, not violently, not like thunder, but like a door being opened from the inside. And then it was Urena who spoke. The villagers called her daughter twice-born. Not as an insult, not as a myth, but as a title carried with both reverence and fear. Some said she dreamed in two voices, that one voice spoke the present while the other answered from the past. Others claimed she walked with two shadows, and if you watched closely at dusk, one would turn before the other. Igema never denied any of it. She never needed to. Her presence did what words could not. She lived near the sacred grove now in a compound with no walls. Anyone could visit, but no one ever entered without first kneeling. Elders sought her counsel when disputes grew too thick with pride. Lovers came to ask if what they felt was true. Even the high priest, once skeptical of her breath's power, now brought offerings of kola and smoke. But it was the mothers who spoke of her most. At night, when the stars blinked like the eyes of old gods, women would sit at the edge of their mats, whispering prayers not to the sky but to the soil. "Igema," they'd murmur, "daughter of dust and voice, let my child sleep without fear. Let the dreams be gentle. Let the truth stay near." And in many homes the children slept easier. Sometimes, when an infant wailed from a hut deep in the hills, the cry would not come in their own mewling voice, but in Urena's. A haunting low lull of a sound. Gentle, melodic, impossible. The first time it happened, the mother dropped her calabash and ran to the cradle. Her baby was still there, but smiling, quiet, eyes wide. And somewhere in the leaves above the roof, a wind passed through that smelled faintly of roasted yam and smoke, Urena's favorite scent. These were not frightening things anymore. The village had come to understand, it was not a haunting. It was a staying. A love too strong to let go. A voice too honest to be swallowed by the grave. Once, a wandering traveler, unaware of the stories, Asked Igemma how she could carry the burden of another life inside her own. She looked at him and smiled. She was never a burden, she said. She was a doorway. And the traveler, though confused, bowed before he left, because something in his chest had begun to ache with a memory he didn't know he had. Igemma tended to no shrine. She preached no sermons. But her presence changed things. Fathers spoke softer around their daughters. Boys stopped mocking girls for asking questions. Even the market gossip changed, now measured by how close it danced to truth. And in every home that had once silenced a woman's story, her name sat heavy in the air. Not Urena. Not just Igemma. But daughter twice born. A name carried in songs sung while cooking, in lullabies hummed into sleeping years, in proverbs taught beside fire pits. Do not lie when the moon is full, they'd say. She listens best then. Do not raise your hand in anger, others warned. Her voice breaks bone before it bends. And when people wandered too close to the hills alone, lost or grieving or drunk on pride, they sometimes returned with red eyes and shaking hands. They would whisper. She spoke. And no one needed to ask what that meant. Because in a world too used to forgetting women's voices, this one had stayed. And it would not be silenced again.